In this video tutorial, I'll take you step by step through the process of making a mixed media piece in layers with acrylic paints, some stamped and textured tissue paper, some stamped images such as the little bird and the letters. You can choose to use any stamps that you have on hand. You can use any words that you want to say and any colors of acrylic that you'd like to use. So in this video, I'll just take you through step by step how to build the layers and create a simple mixed media piece of artwork. I'm using a store-bought canvas that already has a gessoed surface, so I'll be able to go directly to my paints. I'm using Golden brand acrylic colors. This is chromium oxide green. And I'm going to apply paint to the entire surface of the canvas, top and sides, using a sea sponge. A makeup sponge would also do this. So I'm going to spread out some paints on my disposable paper palette. You can use a paper plate or plastic plate for this, and get started. Next, I'm going to use my Liquitex modeling paste to smooth out some of the surface areas on my canvas. This gives me a variety of textures while I'm working and makes the paper hold down a little better when I glue it on for collage. It is a step that you can skip if you don't have modeling paste on hand. You can also spread modeling paste with a plastic table knife, or you can spread it with an old gift card. The one thing you don't want to spread it with is a paintbrush because it's very hard to clean it out. Once you have your modeling paste in place, use a sea sponge or a makeup sponge that you've wet down with some water, and use that to smooth out your modeling paste and kind of brush it across the surface. That way it will be thicker in some areas, thinner in others, again adding to the textures that you can create when you put your tissue layers down. Here I've switched over to a makeup sponge. You'll notice a different texture when you use this type. Different sponges will give you different textures with your modeling paste, which can also add interest to your work. I'm going to continue the process till I'm satisfied with the way it's spread out, and then allow the modeling paste to dry overnight. For this next step, I'm using some papers that I had already stenciled patterns on with some acrylic paints. I'm using Matte Gel by Liquitex for my gluing medium. I like this better than things such as Mod Podge. It has a matte surface, so it's not shiny, and it doesn't tend to get sticky over time. It stays really nice. I use a foam brush to apply my glues. It's easier to clean it up than a bristle brush, and when it's worn out, I don't feel nearly so bad about throwing it away. When you're working with tissue and other papers for a collage, it's usually best to tear your shapes rather than cut them with scissors. The torn edges will accept the glue better and adhere a little bit better. Also, when doing this, you can lay them out first on a dry surface just to plan where you want your colors to be. Once you're ready to go, you can brush your matte medium across the whole canvas to lightly tack down your pieces, or you can work one piece at a time. One thing you do want to do as you're working is overlap those edges so that you have a nice smooth surface that you're working with. For this piece, I began by spreading my canvas with some of the matte medium. That way my pieces will tack down very quickly, and yet I can still move them around if I decide to change the spot where I put something. So I'll start here in the corner, press it down, put another piece in place, and then use my matte medium across the surface to join the edges so that they're smooth. And I'll just keep going across the canvas until I'm satisfied with the results. If it curls up, go back over it in the other direction. I have a little piece that's going over the edge. You can turn it over the edge, or you can tear it off at that point so that there's nothing going over the edge. I also changed colors partway through this. I had some stenciled paper on green, some teal on green, and then I had some that was teal on white. So here I'm blending the two together, which can create a very precise line across your work that you may or may not want to have. But I would go ahead and get your papers down, get them into place, and then make some decisions later about how you want to merge those colors together. Once I had my tissue in place, I did decide that there was just a little too much difference between the light tissue and the dark tissue. So I'm using my Liquitex Basics Titanium White and my green to add just a brush of mixed color over the top of the whole thing, going from the lower left corner to the upper right. Once I had the color in place, I took my wet sea sponge and just smoothed the whole surface out so that the colors were blended nicely, just the way I wanted them to be. And then if I brushed too much away, I just added a little bit more color back until I had the entire piece with the different tones and textures that I wanted to see. Put that aside and get out the next set of materials for the next step. I'm going to be using some Strathmore parchment paper that's normally used for calligraphy work, but this has a nice translucent look to it. And I stamped my little bird stamp onto that paper and then tore it out all around it, leaving some paper. And again, I used my Liquitex matte medium to glue the bird down. You will notice that it's popping up in places. It may take some tapping and re-gluing because this paper is a little heavier and less absorbent than your tissue. I'll also be using some letter stamps, and I'm going to be doing my stamping on some tracing paper because that's going to give me a more translucent look than I was getting with the parchment paper for calligraphy. But you could actually use both quite easily. When you do your stamping, be sure that you're using acid-free, permanent, waterproof stamping inks because we will be applying some mediums over the top, and if you're using a water-based ink, you're going to get smearing. To do your stamping, you want to make sure you're using the archival waterproof ink. Cut or line out your paper so that you know how much of the surface you're going to use for the letters. Have your verse or your whatever you're going to say over to the side where you can keep an eye on it because it is so easy to make a spelling error when you're doing something like this. For this particular one, I was not concerned about having things follow in a line. I just wanted to get the words in sort of a random flowing pattern. And I chose to use one of my favorite Emily Dickinson poems, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. So you'll see me here just doing my stamping. That I do have to offer when you're doing this type of stamping, you'll notice that my stamps are lined up. I have already pre-selected the letters that I'm going to be using, and I have them turned so that the side of the stamp that shows me the letter is facing me. So it makes it a little bit quicker for me to grab the stamps that I need when I need them, and it allows me to work a little quicker. Once I have all my words in place and have checked for spelling errors, I tear the edges, so I tear around it so that I have that surface that will adhere better to my piece. And I just go around it, just tearing from end to end until I have the entire piece. You will notice that I do have some little ink smudges here and there from the edges of my stamps. For this particular piece, I'm not worried about that. I don't need them to be perfectly stamped. They just have a really nice hand-stamped look. And I'm not worried about that. Spelling was the only thing that I had a particular concern about. I use the same technique to glue this down using my Liquitex gel medium. Press it down in place, and because I've used the archival inks that are permanent and waterproof, you'll notice there's no smearing. All I have to do is put the papers down. Because the tracing paper is not as absorbent as other papers, you will notice a little bit of wrinkling and creasing. So you need to stay with this as it dries and use your fingers to gently push it into place until you have it the way you want. Even then, it may bubble up a little bit in spots. You can come back to that later. If you do have some little lumps that have occurred as it dried, one thing that you can do, sometimes you can press them down with your fingers and they will stay down. But if not, you can take a brush with some clean water and brush it gently over those areas of the paper that you've used, because it is tracing paper, not as absorbent, but it will help. And then use your fingers to smooth it out. The last thing that I did on this piece was add some more of my green to the edges. I did it partly with a brush, partly with a sponge, and a whole lot with my fingers. And what I did is took a combination of my titanium white and my chromium oxide green, mixed that color back up that I had been using. Once the color was mixed, I applied it around the edges, and with my sponge, just blend it together right into your sponge and apply it to the edges of your piece. To get a soft finish, wet your sponge, makeup sponge, sea sponge, whatever you have on hand, and gently apply color to the edges and a little bit around the edge to the upper surface. Then use your finger or your thumb to work the paint in, blend it together. Use a little water if it's a little dry and not spreading well. And this will give you a really pretty vintage look of color around the edges moving into the center of your piece. If you should get a little too much of your green paint in an area, wipe some of it off, take a little bit of white on your thumb or finger, and just blend that right in with a towel or your sponge. When you're finished, you have a beautiful piece that's ready for hanging. This project does have a lot of art materials involved. I did include some substitutions in parentheses or suggestions for different materials that you can use. Also, you can get most of these materials locally if you have a Michaels or an AC Moore or a Hobby Lobby or a Joann's craft and fabric store near you. And if not, Amazon is often a really good source for these materials, as well as online suppliers such as Cheap Joe's and Jerry's Artorama and Dick Blick. So lots of places that you can go to purchase these or similar materials.